Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Lure wildlife to your backyard, Part 1. Build a frog pond, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader and Naturalist, Brad Josephs. It's a pleasure as always, Brad. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Hey, thank you. And thanks guys for tuning in. I did this, a similar version to this webinar, actually, early, actually, to be honest, it was this day last year, right as the pandemic began to lock everybody down and stuff. And so I came up with this idea in order to, get people into nature, thinking about not necessarily the vacations that they can't go on into exotic places, but maybe thinking about appreciating their stuff locally. So, but I tried to cram too much into one and ended up being rushed, and I kind of ruined it, I think. So this, I'm going to redo it, and I'm going to break it into two. This is build a frog pond, and then next week is going to be more about native plants and feeding birds in your yard and controlling wildlife pests ethically and stuff like that. So, but yeah, this is going to be a lot about amphibian. So basically I found it really cool. I moved down from Alaska with my wife about 5 years ago, and we picked this area for a number of reasons about being closer to family, and it's a lot cheaper to live down here than Alaska. And but for me, my main motivation to live here when I fell in love with it was the biodiversity is extremely different from Alaska. One of the things that Alaska really in the north really lacks is a lot of insect and amphibian and reptile diversity, and plant diversity and landscaping and gardening opportunities year round. Like Alaska, you just got a very short summer. And so, I mean, it was very, very refreshing. So to me, we moved to a very undeveloped remote area near the Buffalo River in the Ozarks. So this is Arkansas right here. I'm moving my mouse around it in case you guys aren't really sure where it is. And it looks like it's just all part of the Great Plains. It's just north of Louisiana, and it's just east of Oklahoma, and to the west of Tennessee, and to the south of Missouri. So you don't really think about it. You usually normally probably think about it as, especially even if you've driven across I-40, it doesn't really jump out at you as anything spectacular. But there's some really cool, amazingly cool hidden areas, because there's an extremely old mountain range, two of them actually, the Ozarks and the Ouachitas, and they're just full. They're an old, worn-down mountain range. They're not nearly as impressive as even the Appalachians as far as topographic relief, but they're the geology and the watershed and the quality of water and then the biodiversity is pretty spectacular. So I've really enjoyed it. So where I'm coming from is kind of in this area here, right around in Marion County, near the border of Baxter County and near Searcy County, and near the Buffalo River. It's also near the White River. So yeah, so that's where I'm coming from. So of course, there's going to be a lot of folks out there that are maybe going to be jealous. Living remote like we do, I mean, you have to have 4-wheel drive to get to our place. We're 30 minutes from the nearest town or store or anything. Have to be pretty self-sufficient during bad weather and stuff. But we are blessed with lots of very, very kind of a corridor of very pristine habitat and a lot of biodiversity and stuff. Now, I realize that there's going to be a lot of folks that don't live in a place that has the capability to do what we do here and to show you all the cool species and stuff like that. But you can do it. You can do a backyard wildlife habitat wherever you live. But anyway, just because this is my example of what I've done, I'll tell you the story about it. So this is our house. Oops, sorry. This is our house. I'll show you more. I think I took this last summer, I think. So the summertime, very lush. In the winter, this year actually, we do get, relatively mild winters depending on what you're used to. But this winter actually, we had that tremendous cold snap that hit the Midwest. It actually, one of the lowest temperature that I saw one morning, February 16, was -12, and it was so. We do have the capability to get some pretty serious kind of Midwestern winter weather, but for the most part, to me, it just seems subtropical, especially in the summertime. This is what it looks like now. It's starting to green up. Yeah, unfortunately, tomorrow night and tonight we're supposed to get late frosts, but we've already got daffodils. These red bud trees are coming out. We've got a tulip magnolia. So we've got this big, this is a view from my driveway or from my house, looking down into this basin where there's a spring-fed water drainage, and there's kind of an artificial, that was built many years ago out of this earthen dam that holds up this spring or creek called Water Creek. And there is yeah, so it's very beautiful. There's my house up there. So it's a pond. We've got tons and tons of wildlife down there. Lots of frogs, snakes, small fish, kingfishers, herons, otters, beavers, ducks, that sort of stuff. So it's, I mean, for me to attract wildlife up to our house, into our backyard, it's not very difficult because we already have the treasure trove of creatures going on just right down the hill. So if you live right in the middle of the suburbs in a really developed area, you're not going to quite get. It's going to be more of a struggle, but still possible. And yeah, this is the creek that drains out of our pond. It's kind of a cascading waterfall, and there's me chilling out in the water on a 95-degree day in May. So pretty neat. And then there's lots of creeks everywhere that I just roam around everywhere on and check out all the gorgeous wildflowers. We have beautiful wildflowers coming up right now. I'm hoping that tonight and tomorrow doesn't get quite as cold. It's going to really slow down the spring green up, but gorgeous mushrooms. So it's really nice to live in an intact ecosystem with clean water, and you get these kind of indicator species that need clean, pristine places without a lot of chemicals in the soil and the water, such as we're blessed with amazing morel mushrooms that just grow up all around the house, and they'll be starting here probably next week. I'm always excited about that. But this is what the pond looks like in the summer. And to me, it reminds me of being in Borneo, to be honest. I mean, the temperatures, the weather's the same. It's in the mid-90s, humid a lot of times. Sometimes you get well over 100. But it just explodes with insect and reptile, cold-blooded animal diversity. There's another view of the pond, a big pond down there. But as awesome as that is, we just wanted. So when I moved down there, I mean, I'd been trained as a biologist in the the northern regions of boreal forests. I went to the University of Alaska Fairbanks and have a degree in wildlife biology, and I've worked a ton up there with wildlife. And then other areas where I guide around the world, I study and learn and have experience. But I showed up in Arkansas, although I did grow up in North Carolina, so it was very familiar to me, but I had a lot to learn. So one of the things that we did, and you can do it in your region as well, just get on the internet, online, and just look for a master naturalist program in your area, and there's probably one nearby. We had to drive about an hour. So the mission statement of the master naturalist program, which is all over the United States, is, you can read it: develop a core of well-informed volunteers to provide education, outreach, and service dedicated to the beneficial management of natural resources and natural areas within their communities. So I talk about a great hobby. It's also a free education. I mean, it would be, so every Saturday, it would be an 8-hour class where we would go and learn about anything from the geology of our region in the Ozarks to the reptiles, amphibians, learning about frogs. Bird experts would come in and do a class. I mean, it was just, went on forever, about botany, stream management, water quality. And then they'd have lots and lots of opportunities to volunteer, to go clean a stream up or provide any kind of education. So what I've done is I haven't been as active as I used to be, but what I do now sometimes is I'll give talks myself on either bear biology and safety, or also how to build frog pond, like I'm doing now, like this talk I could do there, and that would be one of the things that I would do. So, but the sort of subset, one of the many different subsets, once you graduate from this program, you can kind of pick your specialty, what you want to do. And what I picked was the frogs and toads. And so what you do is you can just join Frog Watch USA, and you have to kind of pass a little class or go through a little seminar, and then you're certified as an observer. So you basically become a citizen scientist. and you monitor if you have to learn all the frog calls, but you can go and you can provide data, and there's enough of these citizen scientists around. If there's enough, you get a lot of data, and they can look at trends, like, wow, the number of boreal toads, or not boreal toads down here, but say dwarf American toads in this certain region has really dropped off. So why is that? Maybe there's a problem because they've put maybe a hog farm upstream, and it's polluted the watershed. So it's pretty awesome ability to monitor when you don't necessarily have the funds for government agencies to do everything that needs to be done. But yeah, so you can get on, and FrogWatch USA, they'll have programs, I'm sure, in Maine and Missouri, Montana, California, all over the place. So basically reporting the calls of frogs and toads. So there are 200 species of frogs and toads that have gone extinct since the 1970s in the world. And really, that's the key thing, is that if you can manage for frogs and amphibians and toads, then you're going to basically have an intact ecosystem. And the reason is it's because their skin is extremely permeable, so that they can absorb oxygen in the water. I'll talk more about their life cycle, but they have a very permeable skin. So even if there's a chemical that's safe for fish, it's not necessarily going to be safe for amphibians, because they will absorb things. So if there are problems in the air quality or the water quality, it's going to be the amphibians that are going to go first. So so the first reason why frogs and toads have gone extinct is habitat loss. So wetlands and forests where frogs, salamanders have been turned into pavement neighborhoods. Diseases, and that is much worse. You can have native diseases in the ecosystem, and all the animals are used to it, and they evolve with it. But if right now, I mean, I think that the coronavirus was kind of a good example. Globalization worsens the spread of diseases. So it could be a virus that just flies from China to the United States, and it jumps across the ocean in 10 hours. Or it could be a fungus, such as the bat fungus that I'll talk about in my next webinar next week, that came from Europe and now is really dangerous for our bats. So it could be any sort of disease. Globalization spreads that, things getting shipped around, and you get invasive insects, invasive plants. Climate change. Well, since amphibians are dependent on water, climate change influences droughts, and that can limit frog populations in a lot of areas. And because of frogs, toads, and amphibians, they have to have clean water to reproduce. And changing climate could influence the timing of the amphibians' reproductive cycles. Then there's predatory invasive species like fish. Like there's a fish down in the southern United States called a snakehead that is a cool fish from, I think, the Amazon. And people they're a beast of a fish, and they like to keep them in aquariums, and they got huge teeth. Well, they got loose, and they can just be voracious on frog populations, toad eggs, tadpoles, things like this. So eat all of them. So the commercial trade, the pet trade, and that's all over the world, and especially in Asia, people get these gorgeous, amazing lizards and geckos, different kinds of frogs, and they want to keep them as a pet because they're exotic. Well, so there are people out there that do that, and it has a huge influence on frog, toad, lizard, amphibian numbers and reptile numbers. Food. There's a lot of amphibians, frogs that are eaten by humans, such as the bullfrog I'll talk about, or they just go out and catch them for bait, for fishing. And then again, like I just mentioned in the very beginning, the pollutants in the air and water, they are the most vulnerable. And speaking of pollutants, I just want to say this right off the bat. This is probably one of, I think, probably the worst thing that we do in the United States for amphibians is the glyphosate-based herbicides. People are too lazy to use safer methods to weed their yards, so they use Roundup. And yeah, and people, Monsanto, who makes Roundup, definitely has come up with their own tests. Who knows how the quality of those tests, that they can get compromised. You can pay these guys enough to do a biological test, but it's not I mean, they're getting paid to do it, so they give the results to the company that the company wants. So there's a lot of controversy on Roundup. A lot of it is it really safe for humans? I don't think so. Depends. You get on the internet, you can find 100 articles, but I don't think it is. But it definitely is. And they say, oh, it's okay for animals and plants and stuff, except weeds, of course. But amphibians, for sure, they absorb that stuff and they can have tremendous problems. So if you can come away as a yard owner in the United States who takes care of their yard, come away with one thing today, I think would be, don't use Roundup. I mean, when I'm at the hardware store and I see these huge aisles of just Roundup and all these crazy chemicals, and you read on it like, oh, you don't let it touch your eyes, don't put it on any vegetables that you want to consume. It's a red flag. And even if you can get away with it, if you follow their directions, keep yourself safe. Even if you don't have a frog pond in your yard, all this stuff washes into the watershed and it builds up, and it can. That's one of the main reasons why we've had such losses of these amazing amphibians. So Roundup is bad, and that is why. So an indicator species, the frog is a fantastic example of indicator species. In my frog pond, if I have a healthy reproducing population of frogs and toads, and in the watersheds, I know that water's clean. If there's all of a sudden if I go to say a pond 10 years ago when and there was just frogs calling in June, July, and then I go 10 years later and they're nothing, but yeah, there's still ducks and there's still fish, but the frogs are gone, I know there's a big problem. So it's an indicator species. And say, frogs are a great keystone species as well. They're kind of the keystone, being kind of the base of the ecosystem, and without them, the ecosystem isn't healthy, and in certain cases can even collapse. And the reason why I say I'm just going to use just frogs is because frogs, they limit insects. They eat lots of insects, and so it's part of that natural balance. And frogs are also a huge prey base for predators. In my frog pond, I've noticed a number of predators that come in, such as herons, otters, bobcats, snakes, even owls. I mean, I had a big loss of a lot of my big frogs one year, couldn't figure out what it was. And finally, my wife came down like really early one morning and we didn't know what was half eating these frogs and these big, and it was a barred owl had come in and had learned to hunt these big frogs at night. So, and that didn't make me real happy, but it's just part of the food chain. That owl needed those. Okay, so this is what happened. So we moved to this beautiful place in the forest with this gorgeous pond. Well, we wanted a little bit more. So just right off our porch, we have this kind of a barren spot. There's a cliff here of limestone, and there's just a pile of clay with grass on it. I mean, it's not anything the cliff is neat, but it was half covered up with clay, and it just wasn't great habitat. So we took it from that, and then this is maybe 2 or 3 years later, then it became this. This is, if we had a landscaper do it, it would be quite an expensive project. I don't know how much, probably $5,000 or $6,000 or $7,000. We did it all ourselves. And so it was a lot of like a blood, sweat, and tears from it, but the rewards were amazing. It just gave us opportunities just for hobbies. In the beginning, it was just driving around in Arkansas collecting these rocks. We wanted to raise it up, and then after that, we had to dig it out and install it, and then we had to start cultivating the plant diversity, so it became a natural ecosystem. Now we have to manage for it. So really, it's a classroom, it's a learning experience, it's a healthy activity, and then the rewards. Whenever we have neighbors come down to visit, they just get out of the car and they're just like, wow, what is that? And I was like, well, we did that when we moved in, and they're just like, whoa. So yeah, it's pretty cool. There's another view from the other side. And it just went from a place where it was not a wildlife attractant area to just now it's just a hot spot. So this is kind of how we started out. Just all winter, we'd be bored or something, and we would just drive around and collect these big rocks. Now, I understand that most people wouldn't be able to handle rocks this big, and it would just, I'm too old to do it, and my back and stuff like that, but we did it. But yeah, I mean, there are contracting services and agencies that can do this kind of stuff for you. So don't just shut this off and say, oh, there's no way in heck I'm going to be able to do that. In a lot of areas, you can't even find rocks. Like when we lived in Alaska, you could never do this. They just don't have this kind of stackable limestone and chert rocks that there. So you'd have to buy them, and that can become very expensive. Anyway, but we live in Arkansas. We were collecting rocks one day, and off the road, and some guy pulls up. We're off some back road, and he kind of is like, "What are you guys doing?" And I said, "Oh man, this is your property." It's on the edge of his property. I'm sorry, we're just collecting rocks. I figured nobody really cares. And he says, "No, man, Arkansas grows rocks." And it is. It seems like it. I mean, it's a masonry worker's paradise here. So we piled up these rocks, and then so we got this giant. This is where we wanted the pond, but we have this huge mound of clay. It's just unsightly and doesn't do much. Well, I tried to remove that clay myself with a wheelbarrow and a shovel, and it was just absolutely brutal. I mean, I would do it for 4 or 5 hours until I couldn't even walk. I was so tired, and I would look at it, and you couldn't even tell I did anything. It's so heavy and wet and hard to dig. And so I had my rancher neighbor come over with his tractor, and he took care of it about an hour and a half, and turned it into that, and dug down as deep as he could, which is probably about 2.5 or 3 feet below the ground level, and to get it as deep as we could. Because well, I'll explain that later. Yeah, we wanted as deep as we could. So it just turned into this huge mess. And I used what's called a transfer pump that I got, and with it basically is like a pump, put a hose in there, plugged it in, and it just kept pumping this water out, and then manually shoveling all of this mud out of there. Now, if you didn't, then what we have to do is have to put a pond liner in there. Now, I'll show you probably the easiest way to do a simple frog pond, just to show you guys that it doesn't have to be such a mammoth or expensive endeavor. You could go to Home Depot right now and pay $200, and you could get these hard-shelled pond liners. And you could either dig it, have somebody dig it for you, put it in there, and you're good to go. You don't have to worry about anything. It's easy. So there's different ways to store that water in. You can use it. You can have cement poured in there to store the water. You can have bentonite clay packed in there to store the water, or you can use a hard-shelled liner. So yeah, it just depends on kind of what you want. So the hard-shelled pond liners are really obviously simple to install, and you can kind of see the exact shape. You don't have much options, but there's tons of different shapes and sizes. But you obviously can't have a giant pond like we have. You couldn't buy a hard-shell pond liner the size of ours. And this also can be difficult to ship or transport, depending on your vehicle. So, but like, let's say you wanted to do this. This is a great way for a small yard. It's super simple. I mean, I could do this in an afternoon. But let's say you couldn't dig or didn't want to dig. You could just have it so where you just stacked up rocks around it, made it look natural, and just filled up around, and then could have a raised pond from a hard-shelled liner. Anyway, that's just one option. But what we did is we used a flexible pond liner, basically like a giant rubber tarp. And there's slightly more work. They're more work to install. And that's what we had to do here, is you also don't want it to get punctured when all that weight of the water comes down on possible small sharp rocks and stuff like that. So we have to have an underlayment to protect it. And so what we use is some old recycled AstroTurf that we got from the dump that people had thrown away, and we looked around for it. We wouldn't want to buy something, and use that. So then the pond liner goes on top of that, and it's protected. So here's the pond liner. It was difficult. I mean, it was because it's a big pond. We had to get two pieces and spread it out and splice it together with this kind of pond liner tape. And there's ways to do it. Either people do it professionally, or you can figure it out yourself like we did. But I will say that if you get a rubber pond liner, there's several different kinds, and this is the most expensive one. It's a rubber one. It's called Epdm rubber pond liner. And if you go on to what kind of pond liner should I use, there are websites that will go through and tell you the pros and cons. And this is definitely the best one. You have to be careful because in real cold temperatures, pond liners can get brittle and they might break. They might, over many years of too much UV sun exposure, they can become brittle. And the cheaper ones are easier to puncture. So once you go to the trouble of doing the pond, you get a leak in the bottom. It would be a huge bummer. So you go ahead. This is very important. You get the most expensive kind you can get. And this one's not able to be punctured very easy at all. And it's actually flexible to minus 45 degrees. And it's UV resistant. So it's worth, this is where you don't want to pinch the pennies. It also doesn't biodegrade, or it doesn't degrade. And so you don't get any kind of toxins or anything like that. Okay, so that's it. So after we put the pond liner in and we tucked it in, and we covered all the exposed surfaces as much as we could with rocks, and then I made little slopes out of clay, kind of like this, so that creatures could crawl in and out as much as I could, and also protect that, especially this exposed side of the pond liner, to any kind of UV radiation and stuff. So there we're coming along, and we wanted it to be pretty. So we did a lot of landscaping around it, and that's where we are at this point. So we just took and made little beds with good soil and with rocks in a nice shape that's aesthetic. And where we didn't have those, we put this mulch. Now mulch is good because it keeps weeds down. It's kind of pretty, but we made a huge mistake. This is where you got to do a lot of research. So what we wanted here was frog habitat. That's what I wanted the most. I think my wife wanted that, but she mostly wanted something like aesthetically beautiful as well. But mostly I was just gunning for healthy amphibian habitat. And so anyway, I didn't really pay attention. And so we got this cedar mulch because, well, cedar doesn't break down and it's pretty. And well, it's something one day I just was like, I think I remember at some point that I saw where you're never supposed to use cedar shavings in an amphibian tank. And I looked it up. Sure enough, cedar is very resistant to insects and rot, like basically is bomb proof. Well, it's because it's got some natural sort of chemicals, alkaloids and stuff in it, that it can be toxic to amphibians. So I had to get rid of it all, and then look for healthier, safer alternatives. So now we use pine bark mulch. Well, we want the pond to be aerated well, so we use this pond pump. I bought it at Home Depot, and it's been running continuously, except when it got way below zero, for 5 years. It never stopped. I have to clean it out like once a year. But basically, okay, what it is there's a pump in here that I think costs about $130. And you put this little guard bag over it so you don't suck up a bunch of things, which will mess up the impeller. And also you don't want to be sucking up all your tadpoles and shredding them up. But once it's protected like that, you just submerge it in the water, and you've got this flexible tube that comes out where we covered it with rocks, and it comes up into here and just continuously flushes the water. So we make a nice waterfall. Ambient sound of it's beautiful. There's a lot of benefits to the sound of running water. And it also aerates the pond. I mean, aquatic creatures, they need oxygen. And if you don't have enough oxygen, just like you have to aerate your fish tank. So that's what this helps to do. So we got a pump. So we're getting there. This is a view from our top porch above. You can see we've got it mulched with a pine bark mulch now. We've got all our little rock garden beds situated, and we're beginning to plant our plants around it to make it pretty and good for all kinds of creatures like pollinators. And you'll see we have all this exposed here. Well, what we did is we just took a bunch of dead rotten logs and put them there, and then kind of filled it in with dirt and let plants grow in. So now the later pictures you'll see looks very natural. And when we're in this, I'm going to talk about this much more in next week's webinar, but what we really got into is planting the native plants. And that's something that we really learned a lot about at the Master Naturalist program, is how important it is to plant native plants. Native plants cater to native pollinators. So if you want to keep your native pollinators happy, use native plants. And there are like Prairie Moon Nursery. That is the company that we use for our region. It's just kind of like this southern Midwest, southeastern region, and And then you go through there and they've just got so many native plants and they're just gorgeous. It's like, why do you always everybody have to use all these exotic plants from that are originally from China or England when there are incredible native flowers and plants that the pollinators like really have evolved to be with. We'll talk more about that next week, such as these cardinal flowers, my favorite flower. Hummingbirds love them. Then you've got Echinacea, this native Echinacea or coneflower, fantastic. So just, they're just as beautiful as any other exotic plant. And they're also hardier and can just grow for years and years and flourish because it's evolved for this climate, this habitat, and these pollinators. So yeah, I mean, the Echinaceas are just fantastic. They're just covered in bees and butterflies all summer long. They're an amazing flower. So we want aquatic plants as well too. So we at Home Depot we bought these floating pots, which are really neat. It's just it's foam around a pot, and so it's just the plants are going to always be wet soil. So you need aquatic plants such as irises and different things like that. And they make little floating islands, which are great safe habitats for frogs. And they even before, as soon as we put them in, we started getting frogs on them, and they loved them. They loved them. And this is one of those floating pots. We were just looking for a ground creeper. This is creeping Jenny, and it's not native, but I mean it can't really spread and get out because it's on a little floating island, and it'd be better if we had a native one. But anyway, so the creeping Jenny, it works for this one, but we've made adjustments and stuff. And then of course things like lilies and everything. As long as you got to be careful, especially here, the native ones are very important because if you use non-native ones and it has access to the native watershed, some of the invasive water plants can be devastating for watersheds, such as like water hyacinth. So if you do choose to use those, you just have to make sure that there's no way for them to get out into any other water sources. But yeah, so lots of irises, lots of lilies, even native American lotus. There's a lotus flower that's native to America. It's incredibly cool. So yeah, I mean, it's beautiful stuff. And here I am in my kayak on my big pond in my yard, just going around and collecting some native aquatic plants that I put up in the pond. And those are great. Watercress is one of my favorites for the cooler weather periods. And so there we have it, and it's there. And you can see I'll get in carefully, not step on any creatures, but it's actually a place when it's super hot out, but I'll just get in there and cool off. So there's the watercress I'm talking about, and that's something that we can actually eat. It's a really delicious, peppery green and very healthy, very nutritious. But you really need a lot of those plants. You're supposed to have something like 70 to 80% coverage with aquatic plants, so that it kind of shades out the algae, which will eventually take the water over and take all the oxygen out of the water. So you need to make sure, and one great way to control algae is to have floating plants cover 70 to 80% of the water surface. And all these plants are fantastic habitat for the tadpoles, the frogs, everything, all the insect larvae and everything like that to use. All right, so we're progressing along. Just another few more pictures from maybe a couple years later. Getting some really good stuff going on. It's always an adventure. Just do a nature walk, see all kinds of different crazy insects. The rocks here, we've stuffed in things like, I can't remember. These are like really tough little plants. The name, it'll hit me in a second. But the lizards love it. They hide in these cracks. And so will the frogs and toads as they come in. The toads love to get in these caves, and then they'll attract their mates from the protection of these caves. So this little cliff habitat that we've created is fantastic as well for lizards and toads. So that's really what you're doing. I mean, a frog pond. I mean, a lot of frogs will live in the water all the time, but what they do is they need it. Not only the frogs, the tree frogs that normally don't live in the water, but they have to have standing water to breed in. Salamanders, which don't live in the water when they're adults, have to have water source to breed in. which you need is it's a mating ground. It's a singles bar. So, and this is a kind of an interesting picture. This is, I don't know why they're doing this, but I've seen this happen with other species of frogs. You've got a male green frog trying to mate with a female bullfrog. It's not going to work out for them. They're not going to hybridize. So I'm not really sure, but that's what they'll do is they'll go ahead and fertilize, and then the female will get into the water and lay eggs. If these were the same species, it would work. At this point, this is just a freak of nature. But that's what happens. So they lay the eggs in the water, and in a few weeks later, the eggs will hatch, and you will have tadpoles. And tadpoles start out breathing underwater like a fish, but their gills are external. They grow these external gills, and they have a tail so that they can swim. And they start out their life as vegetarians mostly, and they clean up all the algae. That tail keeps growing and growing. Now, some frogs take 2 years, like bullfrogs. They will take 2 years of tadpole stage. But a lot of them, the early ones that breed early, they will breed as soon as it gets warm enough. And then by the end of the summer, those tadpoles have already matured. And what happens when a tadpole matures is the tail is used as an energy source for growth. And they will sprout their legs, and then you'll have this strange looking creature with a tail and frog legs. They will absorb those external gills and grow lungs so that they can breathe out of the water. Although their skin always will be permeable enough to actually absorb oxygen in the water if they're not active, such as if they're hibernating in the water. And then the front legs appear, and you've got yourself, and they'll crawl out of the water, and the tail becomes shorter and shorter, and then you've got yourself a young frog that's now able to either, like a toad, go off into the forest and have its life, a tree frog, go up into the trees and live in the trees for the rest of its life, except breeding time, or a bullfrog, which sits by the water and goes in and out. So these are what the egg masses look like. This is why you don't want to have koi in your pond, because the koi will eat every frog egg. So if you've got a koi pond and you watch this and you're like, how come I don't have any frogs? They may come in, or maybe you see them and you never have babies, or you never have tadpoles. The koi will eat anything that's big enough to fit in their mouth. So got to be careful with koi. So yeah, these are the tadpoles that are just starting to hatch, and they're little babies, and they're actually eating the egg sacs, sort of the membranes. And so these things will basically, they try to lay these egg sacs around aquatic vegetation underwater. So that's why it's really important to have things like stuff with roots or watercress, so some kind of structure. And these are strands of toad eggs. And those tadpoles, like I said, that they come out and they begin to graze on the algae that has grown up on the sides of the pond, which is really good because, like I said, too much algae eventually will choke the pond out of oxygen. Now, frogs are carnivorous, but in the beginning of their life, they can eat. So but this is the first tadpoles that appeared, and we didn't have any plants or anything for them to eat. They were just eating a little bit of this algae. So one of the things is to help these guys get along, I would throw, actually, because it was recommended to me, frozen spinach in there, and they just mount it up. And also, I also learned later that I'll throw pieces of meat in there, and then they also, even at this stage, they will eat meat. And if they're big enough, these tadpoles, when they get larger, or larger species of tadpoles, also feed on things like mosquito larvae. So this is the first frog that we have. I actually recorded this sound last night off my porch, so I didn't have the recording ready. So these are the spring peepers, and they can actually hurt your ears if there's too many of them. They actually can damage your ears. So sometimes it can be a little too much, but it's just right. It's amazing. I've even heard them come out and call in February. That's the spring peeper. It's the first frog, and they're tiny, absolutely tiny. But if you ever see one, you can see this this X on the back. It's for the spring peeper. And then there's another very, very small frog, is the Blanchard cricket frog, and they sound like you're rolling little marbles in your hand. These guys will just come in by the hundreds and hundreds, and they make this really exotic sound. Now, as the season progresses from March all the way up until late August, you will get different species. So, like to me, I enjoy different periods. Like my favorite is, say, in August, when in like early August, late July, you have so many different species calling. But as the season progresses, I mean, the sound of these will actually kind of define the seasons a little bit in an auditory manner. And then these Blanchard cricket frogs, when they get big enough, they spread out, these tiny little guys, and there can just hundreds everywhere, just popping all over the place, all over everywhere around the pond. And they go into our gardens. We have vegetable gardens too, I'll talk about next week. And there's a fantastic way to get rid of chiggers and ticks and small insects that are maybe a pest to you or a pest to your garden. So there's another Blanchard's cricket frog, tiny little guy. And then we've got one of my favorites, the bullfrog. And I like having a raised pond so that I can kind of get down and be at eye level with the frogs in the water for photography. So it's kind of difficult otherwise to get high level pictures of frogs like this with a raised pond. I'm gonna play that one more time. That's the classic call to bullfrog. Whoa. That's a bullfrog. And this is a gorgeous frog. This is a big one. So these live for several, like for a long time. They get bigger and bigger. I actually recognize some of these frogs. And of course, yeah, and they get used to me because I go out at night and I check them out. And I even feed them worms. And so Kendall, can you play the that one with the music? This is a little video that I'm gonna play, so turn your speakers up. This is just a little fun compilation of me and this frog that is kind of my friend. I've named him Jeremiah. So go ahead.
Okay, and just a reminder, this window this video player may open in a separate window, or you may need to swipe left or right if you are on a webcam. Hold on one moment here.
Well, I can't get a girl. I can catch a fish, reel it on in, take a little selfie to show all of my friends. I can throw a spinner, or I can throw a crank, impressing all the girls while they're tanning on the bank. Grab a little hook, bait a night crawler, hold on a second, something's pecking at my bobber. Hook set in the lip, makes me wanna take a dip, have your buddy take the pic, yeah. I can catch a fish. Caught in sick and wet a line. My boss done had it for the last time.
Okay, back over to you, Brad.
Okay. This is kind of a fun one. So yeah, I feed that guy and he gets big. Now bullfrogs will eat about anything. They can eat ducks. They'll eat fish. I've seen them eat fish. Snakes. They're amazing predators, and they can get enormous. I'm going to just play this myself because it's going to slow it down. Now, here's me and Jeremiah, and I feed him a worm. Now, it's going to be choppy because I'm playing it myself. I can only play 3 videos. But what you'll notice is watch him as he swallows the worm. Watch his eyes. That's one way that they can force food into their mouth, even large things. They use their eyes. They use muscles to pop their eyes down and help push food into their stomach. Watch his eyes. I just got that with my phone. I'm like 4 inches from him. He doesn't mind because he gets a worm out of the deal, and I get to check him out and get some cool footage. But there's another portrait of my favorite frog friend that I hope comes back here soon. Now, bullfrogs are interesting. They are actually endangered in their native range of the orange because people like to eat frog legs, and then they also suffer from all the other habitat problems and other threats that I mentioned. But really, they're targeted by people do frog gigging. You know, it's easy to see them with their eyes, and they shine, and then they spear them, and they eat frog legs. So actually, you know, here it's great to have bullfrogs around because Like if I talk to the locals, if they go down the Buffalo River, there's not nearly as many bullfrogs as there used to be because too many people have gigged them out and stuff. But the purple are places where people have brought bullfrogs in, probably because they wanted to have them in their pond for frog legs or whatever, or just whatever, and they've taken off. Well, they're not native here, and they're horribly detrimental. And like I've got a wildlife biologist friend in California, and one of his main jobs is to eradicate bullfrogs because they wipe out the native species. They eat the native species of frogs. So they're horrible over to the left in the purple. But over in the orange, it's great to have them around, and they've evolved with the ecosystem. The bronze tree frog. Sorry, I mean bronze or green frog. Your call sounds like you're plucking your guitar. Just bow, bow. So yeah, that's another a large species of frog. Doesn't get as big as the bullfrog, but they make that specific call. And they can be bright green, but there's also a color phase that they known as a bronze frog, and these to be different species, but then they realize that they're the same. And then you've got the leopard frog, and I actually right now I can hear leopard frogs calling right now from out my window, and they're species that goes all the way up into even into Canada, northern Canada, in the boreal forest. So they're really tough species of frog. This is the southern leopard frog. It's actually the most beautiful frog. And there's the call. Oh, okay, yeah. And then you'll notice here, this is called the tympanic membrane. And what that is it's basically an eardrum, but it's on the outside. So if you had, I mean, frog has amazing hearing, both in and out of the water. So what that eardrum does, that tympanic membrane, is it catches vibrations and transfers it into the brain so it can hear mates, it can hear running water for places to breed. But if you had a normal ear like we do with a hole, it would have a lot of problems getting clogged up. So what they have is the eardrum on the outside. So if you ever catch a frog, be very, very careful and gentle with that tympanic membrane. It's actually an external eardrum. Dwarf American toad. The difference between frogs and toads really is toads are very terrestrial. They like to live on the land and in the forest. Well, there's some frogs do as well, but the really difference between the frog and the toad, you'll see the warty skin, but one of the main differences is this guy here, and it's the parotid gland, and it secretes poison. And so you'll notice that big bump. If you have a big bump behind the eye, then it's a toad. If you don't have that and you just have a big tympanic membrane and there's no huge bulge, then it's a frog. And yeah, so dwarf American toads don't get preyed upon by all the animals like frogs do because they secrete a poison. So if your dog all of a sudden, if you starts to vomit and almost have seizures and you're freaking out, you don't know what's happening, it very, very likely could have caught a toad, put it in its mouth, and then spit it out, but got some of that poison in there. But that's why it can irritate the human skin. I wouldn't suggest licking it, but it's not going to kill you. It's not that bad compared to some toads in the world, which are deadly poisonous. But that's the difference between the frog and the toad. Now, toads, we never see toads very often around the pond, but then they just come in by the hundreds during their breeding season, which is kind of early summer. Kendall, you want to play the dwarf American toad?
Yeah, sure.
Just a minute 15. Here's the dwarf American toad in my pond calling. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, back to you, Brad.
All right. Oh, it's amazing that dwarf American toad, how long it can call for. And then we have gray tree frogs, which normally you never see. They live up at the tops of the trees, but like the other ones, they just come in during their specific breeding time in early June, kind of early summer. And they're really, really cool. And a lot of times we see them on our porch, hanging out, especially if we leave a light on at night. They'll climb up in there and get insects. And so that, yeah, so what that throat pouch is called the vocal sac. And it is basically, it amplifies the sound. So the male wants to call a female to attract it. And so he inflates those vocal sacs in his throat. And it's a chamber to amplify the sound that's rushing through his vocal cords. And then we'll play that last video, Kendall.
Okay,
And I know, oh, if it looks weird, it shows a slow motion, which is kind of neat. I do it slow-mo on the calling.
All right, back over to you, Brad.
Okay. Well, you know what? I think I have gone way. I mean, yeah, this just takes too long to explain. So I'm gonna talk a couple little things. The first thing is and then I'm gonna continue on next week. So how a frog hunts is they have the most amazing thing is their tongue. This is gonna blow you away. So, you know, frog can catch a fly with its tongue. Well, a fly has, for 1 second of our life, is 4 seconds for a fly, basically, as it kind of realizes reality. So they have a reaction time that's why you can never swat a fly, because their life and everything that they're taking in is sped up by 4 times us. Well, a frog has a tongue that has 2 muscles, and it will snap this tongue out that has that is a really soft and very sticky end. And it can take its tongue out and pull it back in 0.07 seconds, fast enough for a fly. If we had a tongue like that, it would reach down to our toes, and we could pick up 1.5 times our body weight with our tongue, like a refrigerator. So, pretty amazing. But a lot of times frogs will just tackle things and just, so if I see a grasshopper that has gotten into the water, a frog will just wait and then leap off and just basically just force it into their mouth without having to use the tongue. And their amazing jumping ability is they have a calf muscle that shortens up and it winds up to power into their tendons like a bow and arrow, and they can just shoot off. And that's what that ends that video of the bullfrog, like this amazing jumping ability. And there's a pickerel frog. Okay, so since it's the top of the hour and I want some time for questions, I'm gonna just cut it off here. I've got more stuff to talk about with taking care of frog ponds, but you guys are gonna have to wait till next week, if that's okay. I already see the numbers dropping off. So let me just kind of skip ahead. So this is what I'll talk about next week. Other creatures that will get attracted to your pond. This is just a teaser, how I've had to deal with predators, all the other cool stuff. This is why I can't talk about it now. How to maintain the pond. How to make sure that you're using the right kind of chemicals, that you don't poison your pond. How do you deal with mosquitoes the right way? Dragonflies, all those kind of things. And how do you buy the pond materials and some of those kind of resources that we use. So that's going to all be for next week. And if you want to just check out more of my stuff, I have a blog site, which I will be doing a couple posts when this one's over. I'm going to answer, I'm sure that there's lots of questions that we don't have time to answer. So I'll answer all those questions and then play a recording, have the recording of this webinar on there. It's alaskabearsandwolves.com. There's my Instagram, Brad Joseph's photos. If you like those videos, I have that plus about 100 more really cool animal videos, all kinds, bears, wolves, everything else on my YouTube channel. That's just basically go to YouTube and just search Brad Josephs. And that's where I'm going to wind up. So we got to stick back next week because backyard wildlife enhancement is too big for an hour.
Well, thank you so much, Brad. We've got some really good questions for you, and I know you did say you're gonna address all these questions in your blog post, but I'll try to get to a few in the next 5 or 10 minutes here. So a few people were just wanting you to clarify if you brought frogs in, or did they just come to you naturally after you built your pond?
That's a great question. They just came to my pond because, like I said, I'm super lucky. I've got a natural water source that's full of these species. I just provided an extra, actually safer, more stable breeding ground for them right next to our house, so we could enjoy it. And the way frogs find it is they can hear water, they can hear running water, but they also have some mysterious thing that I don't fully understand. They have some way in their eye to be able to detect reflected water from a distance. So that's how they kind of find the water. Once they know it's there, then they know it's there. They map it into their mind. I guess if you had a place where there's not a chance that any frogs would ever come, you could put them in there. But from what I've learned from my people that have taught me and stuff I've read is with frogs, if you build it, they will come. Mm-hmm. So I guess that you're limited if you live in the middle of suburban Chicago, far away from any water source, and they're just never going to find it. You can, maybe think of some alternatives. Right. But yeah, so that's it. So I didn't bring any frogs in. You're really not supposed to transplant too many amphibians. It kind of messes them up because they, even animals with a brain as simple as an amphibian has a mental GPS system in their mind. It's actually a lot more complex than ours, but it can like say a turtle. If I see a turtle crossing the road and I want to, I'll take it back to my place where it's safe and it can live in the forest. They can maybe try to get back to where they're supposed to be, and it can really mess them up. Okay, that's it.
Yeah. And how long did it take for the wildlife to find your pond?
Every year, as long as we keep it maintained, which I'll talk about next week, the proper way. Every year it just keeps increasing. But within the first summer, we already had, if we completed our pond where it had water in there in I think something like mid-April, and by early June, there were the Blanchard's cricket frogs and some of the other frogs that already found it and were already using it to breed. And then since then, now I've got residents like Jeremiah and some resident leopard frogs and resident green frogs that basically they overwinter in the pond, and as soon as the water gets warm enough, they just show up. They just appear because they've been there the whole time. That takes a few years to get to that point. Okay.
And on that subject, a few people were wondering what frogs did in the winter. Do they hibernate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll address that. You have to worry about that a lot. Your depth of your pond. So for me, I wanted to have an area that was pretty shallow in one spot so that it warms up quicker and easier, but I also wanted a spot that's much deeper with some organic material at the bottom, because like green frogs and bullfrogs, they basically go underneath the water at the bottom and they will bury themselves in the mud and estivate. It's a hibernation phase where they just absorb oxygen in their skin because they're not active, and they can live like that. If my pond was only 6 inches deep and it froze all the way solid, there would be some mortality. Some of the other frogs will go off into some of our garden beds and then bury themselves into the dirt, hopefully below the frost line, and be able to survive that way. A lot of the other frogs, like the wood frog, is a frog that buries himself in the ground, and they can live in very, very far northern areas where the ground will freeze up several feet down. and their body's actually made to freeze up. And you know, maybe I'll talk about that. That's a really cool. But they can actually freeze solid because they have this system in their liver that stores so much sugar that they release when they're getting cold. It's like antifreeze. So their cells don't actually get damaged in the freezing process. So it just depends on the different species. Yeah, so I guess that's the short answer.
Yeah. And so how deep do you recommend making your pond if you want these guys to overwinter?
You know, it really depends on if you live in northern Minnesota, if it was me, I would have it deeper than I would need it to be in Louisiana. So it's kind of tough. As deep as you can, you know, theoretically get it is going to be the better. But I think maybe 3 or 4 feet would be great. But in warmer climates or for some species, you could get away with less. But yeah, so my pond froze over, and so I'm hoping the big guys, because we had -12, we had a lot of below zero nights, and it froze really thick. And I'm actually just and I've seen a couple big frogs already on warm days, and I'm like, oh, good, they made it. You know, but some of those tadpoles that overwinter for 2-year cycle, it's kind of the deeper the better, I think. Is my best answer. And the farther colder place you live, the better. There are ways that you can put heaters in your pond that keep the water warm in the winter so it doesn't freeze as much. But and I got one of those or a couple of those, and they didn't, when it got below zero, they didn't work that great. But you do have some options that way. I could upgrade and get better stuff, more expensive. But, okay.
So a few people were wondering if these various species of frogs eat each other, if the bigger ones will eat the smaller ones, or the eggs or tadpoles.
They do, yeah. It's a frog eat frog world in there. And so yes, the big frogs will eat the small ones, and that's just the food chain doing its thing. And there's a lot of things that'll eat tadpoles, and I will talk about some of those predators later. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just I enjoy having a food chain in there, and frogs are a species that can survive in competition with other species, and you get a natural balance, takes care of itself. But yes, frogs will eat other frogs for sure.
So there was a question here about where your water came from to fill your pond.
Yeah, so we used, in the beginning, to fill it up, we have a well water, so it's clean. You know, and I thought about that actually, and I forgot to kind of look it up because I didn't have to worry. I've had well water forever. Whether or not you could use tap water that had chlorine in it, well, you could, because the chlorine will evaporate out of that water fairly quickly. And what you would do is you would hope that you would have enough rainwater to maintain it. So right now we have enough rainwater to maintain it almost always. But sometimes during a really, really hot, dry period, we will put our hose in there. But we're putting in just basically natural well water. So it's not a problem. So, but yes, I think you may have a problem if you were just constantly having to dump in city water that was chlorinated. And I don't know what I would do. I would maybe put it into an external tank, or, you know, like something that where the chlorine could kind of evaporate off after a week or so, and then put it in. It could get complicated if you're just running city water. But maybe I'll look that up a little bit more and do some reading on it and address that issue again next week.
Yeah, that'd be great. Okay, last question I'll ask you today is someone here, it looks like he's got his own pond, and he said he turned off the pump to encourage tadpoles and frogs. Did he do the right thing?
I don't know. We don't turn off our pond because our pump. The only thing that I would be nervous about is if you didn't have that protective netting that would suck those tadpoles into the impeller. That would be bad. The oxygen is quite important, and I think that the sound of the running water will kind of help attract creatures. But once the frogs know it's there, if you don't have an oxygen problem, and one of the other ways to get a lot of good oxygen, dissolved oxygen in your water, is to have less algae, but more aquatic plants. I think that if we turned our pump off, we would still have plenty of frogs, as long as we made sure we had enough oxygen and not too much algae. But I will say this, just in case you're not here next week when I talk about this more. Never put the pond algae, the algae cleaners in there. I just wouldn't feel safe about putting chemicals that kill algae in there. Speaking of the algae, so.
Okay, great tip. Thank you so much, Brad. And just again, a reminder to our audience, Brad is going to be doing a blog post to answer any of the questions we didn't get to today. So keep an eye out for that on his blog. And of course, he'll be joining us next week for some more information. So, all right, Brad, I'm going to turn it back over to you for closing comments.
Okay, well, thanks, guys. I just think that even though I kind of live in a place where this is optimal, this is why I moved down here, because to me, this is my dream, is to be able to go on night walks right off my porch, look at all this stuff happening, shine the light in the water and see all these this food chain happening, be able to go to bed at night and hear the sound of frogs and feel like I'm in Borneo. So, but that being said, don't let that discourage you. Anything you can do, any of these kind of lessons about thinking twice before you use chemicals or putting some kind of water source in there, and it's just more of a mindset that if everybody did it, everything would be healthier. Our air would be healthier, our water would be healthier. So it's just ways is everybody just starts to think that way, and ask yourself, should I be spraying Roundup on those weeds, or should I look for an alternative? Should I be broadcasting poison in my lawn to get rid of grubs, or should I find something else? You just think about how satisfying it is to have a natural, to the best of your location and your ability, like a natural ecosystem, that you don't have to fly somewhere or drive somewhere to enjoy nature, is really important. I think it's good for the mind and good for the soul, and it's good for the health of our whole country, the whole world, our whole world. So yeah, that's it, guys. Tune in next week. We're gonna go much deeper. I'm gonna have my wife join me because she's the native flower expert. So, and yeah, thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. And that's it.
Thanks again, Brad. We look forward to meeting your wife. It's going to be great. So thank you so much for taking the time to present today. I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.